Thanks, Dave. I don't have a large collection of tools, but every once in a while I have to do a job, and it'll require a tool I don't have, and that's my opportunity to go get a new one. I did tell Lisa, I have to get it, because I need it for this job. So this is one of my tools. So it's a jigsaw, and I needed it one occasion, so I went and I got this one, and I like it. It's nice and heavy. It's a big one. It's nice and solid. You know how some tools, you hold them in your hand, they feel really cheap and flimsy? Like as if you pull the trigger to turn it on, it's going to fly apart right in your hand. This one doesn't feel like that. This one's good and solid and sturdy. It's got good parts, easy to use, easy to click a blade in and out of. And plugging a jigsaw into the wall, it's not battery powered, right? Plugging a jigsaw into the wall, it's more power than you're ever going to need to jigsaw through something. So really like it. I've used it for those little odd cuts that you're not sure what else to use, and otherwise you might have to use a handsaw, and who wants to do that? So playing with power tools more fun. So there's just some of those cuts where a circular saw is going to leave a weird curved cut, but a jigsaw has a nice straight cut if you have to just sort of stop mid-cut at a certain point at your length, or if you have to cut curves or some kind of wavy line or a circular pattern, a jigsaw is good for that. A couple times I had to just take a notch out of the side of a piece of wood so that it would go in beside the copper piping, and a jigsaw is good for that, just notching out a piece rather than getting a hammer and a chisel. It's good for various jobs, but the specific job that I needed this jigsaw for, and here I'm going to have to back my story up a little bit. Lisa and I were married for about 8 years before we bought our first house, our house in Saskatchewan. We had lived in apartments all that time of our early married life, and we finally were able to buy a house, and we're all excited. We'd been saving up, and we're looking at just the right house to buy. And one of the things I was telling my friends is, I can't wait to have a house with a backyard so that I can have a fire pit back there. But I don't like to mow my lawn around obstacles. So I wanted a fire pit that could be moved so that you can have your fire, and then after it's cooled down, you can just put the fire pit, I don't know, behind the shed or something so that you can just mow your lawn easy. But I wanted a fire pit, and that's what I was talking to my friends about. So Lisa and I, one time, went to church camp for about a week after we were into our new house, and we came back, and I looked out my window, and there in the backyard was a fire pit that my friends had brought over. And they just made it up, fabricated it up, gave it to us, set it in our yard while we were away. So that was pretty cool. And it could hold a fire, and it was mobile. Here's how they made it. They took an old washing machine and grabbed the bin from inside. Yeah, does anybody use a fire pit like that around here? This is all the rage out west. All the campsites have them now. And you grab the metal bin from inside the washing machine, and it's perforated with holes, right? And it's a large steel bin. And because I wanted it mobile, they welded this thing onto a lawnmower chassis. So there was no blade, there was no motor, but there was a push mower chassis with the 4 wheels and the handlebar and the washing machine basin welded onto it. And it worked. We could have a fire in it, we could roast our marshmallows, cook our hot dogs, have friends over, and afterward, I could just grab the handle and wheel it over behind the shed. I'm not sure if Jim Mullahan's here this morning, but yes, Jim, we always put the fire out, made sure it was cool before we rolled it into the tall grass, but Jim's a firefighter out his way. But what I noticed with this this fire pit that they created was it was too tall. So even though there was holes perforating the side of the drum, it still was difficult to get enough airflow that the fire could rage. And instead, we often got a really smoldering, smoky kind of a fire coming out of this thing. So I wanted to cut the top off this steel drum. So I wanted to do. I wanted to cut it about halfway down. But I didn't know what tool to use. I couldn't use a hacksaw. That wasn't going to get the job done. I needed something that could cut a line, the whole circumference of this barrel. So the idea struck me. I could go and get me a jigsaw. Because jigsaw can do that. It doesn't have to be an accurate cut. I mean, the whole thing's a tub on a lawnmower chassis. It doesn't have to look great. It just has to get the job done, right? I knew that these guys could cut through metal, and so went and got me a jigsaw for that purpose. Now, can I get Rob Holmes up here for a second, please? Yeah, please. I just randomly picking you out. Because people can't see these, and I want you to tell people the difference between these two blades. Maybe come right up by the mic. What is the difference in the teeth pattern of those two blades?
These are bigger teeth, and those are really fine and close together.
Okay, so this one has more teeth on it.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what is this one for, this blade?
So that one's for metal.
What's this one for?
That'd be for wood.
Okay, now you can't read that on here though, right? Because it's all scraped off.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Rob. Give Rob a hand. He gets applause for identifying that the teeth here are coarser than the teeth there. All right. It's a tough job. So this one is for cutting metal. This one is for cutting wood. When I got this and went to cut the metal bin, which did I use? Wouldn't it be a very interesting story if I used the metal one, right? I used the wood one, but I didn't know it was written right on the side, "This is for wood, dummy." So I plugged the blade in, and I drew a line around the outside of the barrel. I put the jigsaw on it, pulled the trigger, and the blade was in one of the holes, so it was really nice and smooth. It runs really, really nice. And then I pushed it up to when it hit the metal. And what do you think happened? It started jumping. It's jumping around, and it's vibrating, and the barrel's vibrating, my hand's vibrating, my arm's vibrating, and it's popping up and down off the barrel, and so I kept going, of course. Because it felt absolutely natural. So I kept going, and then I stopped because it did feel like there was a problem after a few seconds. And so I'm looking at the jigsaw, and I'm looking at the blade, and what don't I notice on the blade now? I don't notice that it says wood. And why doesn't it say wood? Because by now it's all scraped off that it's supposed to be a wood blade. So I didn't know any better, so I kept going. And I got that whole bin cut with a wood blade. I did the whole thing. The whole washing machine barrel I cut with the wood blade. So that's a problem. I didn't know I was using the wrong blade. By the time I suspected, something was amiss. And by the time I inspected the jigsaw and the blade, Yeah, the wood label was all wiped off, and I didn't know that I was using the wrong blade for the job. In fact, I was using a good quality blade, and I was using a good quality tool, but I was using the wrong blade. And in the end, the blade became useless. Couldn't use that blade anymore. And the cut line around the barrel was about the most hack job you ever did see of a metal kind of a cut. I thought of this story while I was reflecting on today's scripture, because our lesson today comes from the history of King Saul. And he was the first king of Israel. Now, the life of Saul, as told in the Old Testament, is too long and has too much detail for us to cover in one sermon. So we'll look at a few key scriptures, and I want to give you a broad view of his life and what went on with him. And the main point to remember is that God did not want a king set over his people, right? That was never God's intention. He never wanted a king. God was happy with the current setup. God had a direct link to his people. When necessary, he used a spokesperson. Sometimes that person was called a prophet. Sometimes it was a woman and she was called a prophetess. Sometimes the person was called a judge. Not a judge in the sense that we use it today, sitting in a courtroom deciding who's right and wrong between two people or two parties, but more like a judge who is a leader who lives among the people, who listens to God and then shows them what is right by the way they live. They lead by example. God was satisfied to continue using prophets and judges and priests and Levites to speak to Israel, reveal his will, and invite their obedience to him. Never once did God suggest a king was needed to be in leadership over them. It's the people who wanted a king. The people wanted a human person who would project the strength and confidence that is becoming for a mature nation which has a place on the world stage. But God never wanted that kind of authority and power centralized into one person. Out of 43 kings listed in the Old Testament, out of all those men who ruled one after the other, decade after decade after decade, 43 different men given authority over God's people, and God himself never wanted any of those people in place to begin with. Never wanted a king. God knew that the people did not know what they were asking for. To place a human person in absolute charge over God's people will not only bring ruin to the nation as their hearts drift further away in disobedience, but the whole exercise will also ruin the man who will be king. Just as a wood blade is destroyed when applied to the task of cutting through metal. The king will ultimately find himself at odds at some time or other against the spokespersons for God. God knew that the kings would inevitably run roughshod over the prophets, the priests, and the Levites. When confronted by the prophets, if they have to confront the king and say, "You've been disobedient here," he's going to react and say, "Whoa, it's you who is out of line." When the king's ritual participation is called for by the priests, he won't show up, but instead he'll invent his own rituals, because that's what happens when people let power go to their heads. When the Levites keep stewardship over the sacred items in the temple, the king will use them as though they are set apart for his use and not God's. And when the king sees that the people are worshiping God, he would even get uppity about that and decide, wait a minute, I am the king, I am the authority, people should be worshiping and serving me. And the tragedy is many of those kings fell into those patterns. And now, to be fair, God did his best with the hand he was dealt. Saul wasn't so bad at first. I'm going to read you just a few verses of his backstory in 1 Samuel chapter 9. It says this about him. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite. And he was a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul. Saul was a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Later, when he was chosen as king, as Heather read for us, it is said that he hid among the luggage. He didn't want the responsibility of becoming king. When it was time to select him, he kind of ran away. And I see that as a sign of genuine humility. This guy Saul is strong and capable, yet at the same time humble. There's another story there in chapter 9 where Saul is looking for his father's lost donkey, his livestock. And to get help, he goes to the city and seeks out advice from the man of God. Another example of humility, that he would seek help from God's spokesperson. And so when the Israelites asked God for a king, and even though God knew it was not in their best interest, God respected the choice of the people. It's amazing that God does that. He respects our choices. He could have said to them, no king for you. That's a bad idea. It's not going to happen. But he didn't say no. He allowed them to make their request, and then he gave them their king. And when God looked around at all the nation, at all the candidates, God did not scrape the bottom of the barrel. He chose a strong representative from a respected and healthy family who came from a humble clan, a humble tribe of Israel. God chose someone with a mix of strength and humility and installed him as their king. Not only did he give them a solid candidate, but God also gave the king a noble responsibility. Save my people from their enemies, he told them. But for Saul, the beginning was his best couple years. And he ran off the rails after that. The enemies he was supposed to defeat were the Philistines. And the Philistines had a secret weapon, a champion of a man who stood over 8 feet tall. He stood across the valley and shouted to Saul and all of Israel's army, "If you can defeat me, then all of us will surrender." What was that Philistine champion's name? Do you remember? That's Goliath, right? That's that story of Goliath. And when faced with taunts from Goliath the warrior, what did King Saul of Israel do? He froze. He froze. I've never seen this happen, but I've heard that sheep, when they are anxious, they'll do that. Sheep don't run, they don't flee, they don't turn and fight. When they get stressed, when they are chased, they just drop. This king of Israel, and let us remember that it was the people who wanted a king so that he could bravely lead them into battle. This very king who is now in charge did not even square off against the first real challenge he faced. Instead, he froze. They sat in stalemate. He allowed his army to listen to Goliath's taunts and to lose morale day after day after day. And in the end, who was it that stood up against Goliath, this enemy of God? It was David, right? A young shepherd boy, David, at that. Saul had failed the test of fear. And there was another time when Saul wanted to worship God, but he did not consult the priest. And there were times when Saul was victorious in battle, but David, he shone brighter. And in the end, Saul was driven mad by his jealousy, consulted a witch about the future. And then these verses become the end of his story in 1 Samuel chapter 31. This is how the story of Saul ends. 1 Samuel 31, verse 2 to 7. The Philistines in battle overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these enemies come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. And here's the summary of his life. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. The tragic irony is that Saul was defeated by the very enemies which God had called him to defeat. He was overcome by the very problem he was called to solve. When I think about God's role in the life of Saul, I learned something about God's character. It would seem that he is a respecter of persons' choices. They wanted a king. God knew it would go badly, yet he took the selection seriously. He gave them the best king he could find, and he gave that king a task worthy of a king. It would seem that God tries his best for us even when we choose poorly. And God did his best, knowing that he was asking a wooden blade to cut through metal, knowing that a human person could never properly be a king over God's people. Yet still, God set up Saul so that Saul had the best chance to succeed that could be expected. But then it would also seem to me that Saul should have stepped up, even when he felt he was in over his head. When I used the wrong jigsaw blade to cut that metal barrel, yes, it was the wrong job for the perfectly good tool. And yes, it took a toll on that little blade, even to the point of being unusable for anything else. But here's the rub. That little blade got the job done that I asked it to do. That wood-cutting blade hacked and tore and chipped and cut its way through the entire circumference of that barrel until the whole thing was severed in half. The foolish user did not know he was asking too much of the blade, yet the blade did not use that as an excuse. It did not snap, it did not break, it did not quit. The blade was obedient to its task, and it, pardon the pun, but that little blade saw the job through. All right. I wasn't sure you were going to catch that. I wasn't sure what to... But King Saul found himself installed as leader over a whole nation overnight. And when he was overwhelmed at the complexity of the task, he did not run towards God, seeking ever more intensely God's wisdom and strength and boldness and confidence. Rather, he retreated back into fear and doubt and self-preservation. I think the tragedy of Saul is that he had a choice. He started off with the right mix in his character of capability and humility. But when he started to feel overwhelmed, he did not persevere with God as his helper. Rather, he crumbled, ruining his own life and setting a horrible example for the nation he led. Saul is a good negative example for us. When times get tough, do you seek God's strength, or do you just allow yourself to get overwhelmed? Communion is a good time to think about that question. Communion puts the thought back into our own mind and into our heart. I can do all things he has given me to do because I do them on his strength, not on mine. Amen.